We're going to have to get into Kierkegaard here in just a moment. But again, I want to talk about some reactions against this way of doing philosophy, the way that was popularized by people like Kant and Hegel. Because it seems like, 19th century philosophy and a lot of philosophy before it is preoccupied with systemization, right? People talk about Hegel's system. When we get to Kierkegaard, you'll see that, right? He's always talking about the system. And everything sort of fits nicely, and everything has a place, and everything can be explained rationally, right? There's a big resistance to this in the late 19th century. You have the movement of Romanticism, which can largely be seen as a reaction to Hegel and people like Hegel, this Enlightenment style philosophy. It's very systematic, right? Kant, he's got a philosophy of everything, a philosophy of ethics and epistemology and metaphysics, or anti-metaphysics, right? But he's very complete. He's even got a philosophy of art and things like that. Everything can be explained, everything can be put into a system and explained rationally. Romanticism can be largely seen as a reaction against this. You can also put people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche in this camp as, I think, reacting against this systematic approach to philosophy, right? Or just philosophy in general. It's odd that I pair these two together, right? Because Kierkegaard was a very religious man, or at least he seemed to be very focused on religious belief, and Nietzsche was an atheist. But I think that some of their criticisms of this systematic approach to philosophy they're kind of coming from the same place. Now, can anybody tell me anything about Romanticism? Maybe you study this in an art history class, the Romantics. Poets and artists that did romantic poetry and art. It's not like, you hear the word romantic today and you're just thinking like some cheesy romance novel with like Fabio on the cover, right? Is that what you read or what? Maybe. Now you like the Twilight books, right? Is that? No. I'm just picking on you. Nobody knows Romanticism? No?
Like Shakespeare, so.
Well, yeah, I guess, Shakespeare's a little early for Romanticism. He's more like late Renaissance. But the Romantics were very influenced by him, right? They thought, this guy was obviously like a lover. He loved life. He was very in touch with human emotion and things like that. A lot of them saw this new philosophy and this new science as very cold and calculating and not in touch with human emotion. In fact, it was anti-emotions, right? It was all about being rational and reasonable, and everything has to sort of be thought out with logical reasoning. And the Romantics were like, there's nothing wrong with emotion. Emotion is good. It makes us human. It makes us beautiful and wonderful, right? A lot of them were inspired by Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We talked about him a little bit at the beginning of the semester, but Rousseau had this idea of a noble savage. Most of the Europeans were looking at savages, what they called savages, people who were living in Africa and South America where they were colonizing. They were like, these people are savages, they're not civilized like us Europeans, right? But Rousseau had this concept of the savage as noble, the noble savage, that he was in touch with the earth, he was in touch with his fellow man, and that living off the earth and being in touch with the world was a good thing, and that modern society had moved away from that. So a lot of the Romantics were very inspired by this way of thinking, and people like Keats and Yeats and all these British poets, they'd go out to the countryside, get away from the big cities, to write their poetry and smoke opium, basically, and then they'd get really bored, and be like, geez, let's go back to the city and party because this is really boring. But those are the Romantics, right? Again, if you listen to romantic music, right, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, right, it's very emotional, as opposed to Bach, which can be very beautiful, but it's also very structured, very ordered, very ornate, very complex. It's not as loose and as passionate as something like a Beethoven sonata or Chopin piano piece or something like that, right? So that's Romanticism, right? And a a lot with English scholars, English professors. They kind of throw people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche into the pile with the Romantics, which I don't think they would like. I don't think that either Kierkegaard or Nietzsche would consider themselves Romantics. Although I guess technically they were writing and publishing their work during the Romantic period. If you ever take a class in music theory or art history or whatever, they divide stuff up into periods. You get the Baroque and the Classical period. You have the Romantic period, right? 19th century Romantic period. So they're writing during this time, but I don't think they were Romantic. Right? Again, they were both rebelling against this systematic approach, but not really opting for that sort of romanticist vein of thinking. Although I think they too would say that emotion and human passions and drives are important things and can't really be encapsulated in a system. I think that's where Kierkegaard and Nietzsche really meet eye to eye. That there's something the system leaves out. And it's something that really can't be put in. Now, they might have different words for it, right? Nietzsche might talk about perspective, and the perspective is different, and we can't really encapsulate all perspective. Kierkegaard focuses on the individual, right? For him, the individual, myself as an individual, existing in the world, I really can't fit into a system. Now, there's ways that I can think of myself, that I can sort of fit myself into a system, but it's always going to leave something out. Because as an individual, I have to deal with the world in a certain way that is my way, and no one else's. So Kierkegaard, right? Let's get his full name up here. He is a Danish philosopher. The only real famous, at least internationally famous Danish philosopher. Right? Soren Kierkegaard, quite an interesting character. Just talking about his life is pretty interesting, but there's so much to cover. We're not going to get much biography here. What is he? 1813 to 1855, and really, this guy was not taken very seriously as a philosopher, and he didn't really start to gain influence until probably about 50 years, 60 years after his death. Maybe even longer. It probably wasn't until like the 20s, the 1920s, that Kierkegaard really started to gain a lot of influence in a major way, right? When we saw the rise of the existentialism. So for Kierkegaard, the deal is we've got to figure out the individual, but the problem is we can't. Because it's sort of like something we all have to deal with on our own level, right? As an individual. He often wrote under a pseudonymous authorship. What does that mean, pseudonymous authorship? Under a pseudonym. What is that? Yeah, a pseudonym, a fake name. Okay, why would you write under a pseudonym? Why would you do that?
Because you're writing things that are going to affect.
Okay, that's typically the reason. Not always. That's one of the more popular reasons. It's like, well, you know that if people knew you were writing it, you might get arrested or get in trouble, right? That's not why he wrote in a pseudonym. Sometimes women would write under a pseudonym. Why would women write under a pseudonym?
So that people aren't biased.
Yeah, when most people were sexist, they thought, women, like, if women wrote it, then there's nothing I can learn from it. They wouldn't take it seriously, right? Must be a romance novel or something like that, one of those crazy books, right? So people like George Sand, right? She was a woman, but she wrote as George Sand because people thought she was a man. Some would just, S.E. Hinton, right? The Outsiders, I heard, kind of did that. She wanted to be ambiguous, right? She wanted people to know that she was a woman, not focus on that, right? So those are some reasons for pseudonyms, but that's not his reasons for going under pseudonym, right? He doesn't want to hide his identity. Rather, he wants to represent different subjective viewpoints. He's writing from a different perspective, from a different character. Imagine if you were like this person. This might be what you're thinking. These might be your emotion. This might be your intentions, right? exist is an issue. It's a problem for human beings, right? Existence itself is a problem for human beings. And it's an issue, the fact that we exist, right? We have to deal with it on this basic level. Like, what am I going to do with my existence, right? How am I going to see myself? How are others going to see me? Right? These are concerns that we have, and these are issues that we really can't resolve them in the abstract, like Hegel wants us to. We can't just think about them and, it fits in a system and then I'll just do that and whatever. But paradoxically, we can't resolve them without thinking about them, right? Thought will not get to the solution, but we got to think about it, or else we'll never find the solution. So instead of approaching this systematically like Hegel would, Kierkegaard thinks that he can just present us with these different characters, and we can see ourselves as possibly being this way. This is a possibility that we might enact. What if I saw the world through the eyes of this character? What if I valued things in the same way that this person did? And this technique he calls indirect communication. He's communicating indirectly through these characters, through these different voices, right? Through these different authors. Each of them present us with a possibility that we might actualize in our own lives. And this is supposed to foster self-examination on our parts, right? It reveals to us alternatives, and it stimulates self-examination. And through this technique of indirect communication, he thinks he can reveal to most of us that we're all living in some varying degrees of self-deception. All of us are somehow lying to ourselves, says Kierkegaard. And there's one particular illusion that he really wants us to be aware of, and I guess this is more for his time period. He's talking to his particular contemporaries. But there's one illusion that he wants to dispel. Most of them believe that they are Christian, and he thinks they're not. They think they are, but they're not. They actually believe they're Christians, and so he wants to clarify what it actually means to be a Christian. Now, in the 19th century Denmark, when you were born, you were given a birth certificate, and you were automatically given membership to the church, the state church, right? And so you're Christian, right? No, says Kierkegaard. Just because you're given that designation, just because your parents labeled you something, it doesn't mean you are it. It doesn't mean you are a Christian. So we're going to have to talk about what he means by that. What does it mean to be a Christian? Well, we can at least start talking about faith, okay? Because that's a big deal for him. One of his most famous books is called Fear and Trembling. And in this book, he spends a lot of time dealing with the issue of faith. What is it? What does it mean to have it? And at the very beginning section of Fear and Trembling, he makes this interesting analogy between faith and skepticism. He compares these two passions. He calls them passions. Faith is a passion. Skepticism is a passion. And for him, they are quite similar. On the face of it, though, you'd think they're not similar. In fact, you might think that they are diametrically opposed to one another. Faith versus skepticism? What does it mean to have faith? What do you think? What does faith mean? Somebody asks you, what does it mean to have faith?
Maybe a creed or something.
Okay, so you believe in a creator. That would be an example of faith, right? So it's a kind of a it's a special kind of a belief, right? I mean, like, I believe this desk is here, but is that faith?
Is it more like believing without proof?
I think that's a good stab, and it's a good try. Yeah, I think that's close. You know, he's more complicated, but yeah, it's sort of like you believe something even though there's not necessarily a proof for it. In fact, you believe something maybe even if there's proof against it, like despite the proof, right? You're going to believe it on faith alone, right? Skepticism, what is that?
Like not knowing for sure.
Yeah, like you're doubting, you're questioning, and a lot of times you're questioning stuff that there is proof for. Like if I'm Kierkegaard and there's an evil genius, I might doubt that there's a desk here. Maybe it's an illusion. Maybe I'm dreaming. Maybe I'm hallucinating. You know, maybe the evil genius is tricking me, thinking you think there's a desk here, and there really isn't, right? So again, it seems like these are at two ends of the spectrum. Faith, believing in something despite evidence against it, or despite lack of evidence. Skepticism is doubting something even if there is evidence. So how can he say that these are the same? How can he say that they're very similar passions? Well, maybe you remember Descartes. It hasn't been that long. We just had the test, and most of you wrote on Descartes. So remember, when we first were talking about him, and we were going over this idea of an evil genius, okay? And maybe that day that we were covering it, and we were going over Descartes, you know, a lot of you thought he was crazy. You're like, this dude is like smoking crack. What's the deal? But some of you, maybe you kind of entertained this idea yourself. You thought, well, maybe he's right. Like, it could be true. It could be true that my whole life is a dream. It could be true that everything's an illusion. It could be true. I could doubt everything. But you didn't really doubt everything, right? You might have entertained the possibility, but when you left class that day, when you walked out of here, you put your books down. Did you doubt the world around you the rest of the day? You know, when you're driving on the highway, were you thinking, maybe this is an illusion, maybe if I just drive off the side, nothing will happen, it's just all a dream, right? No, of course not.
I think that sometimes.
You do think that sometimes. I don't want to be driving in the car and you're behind the wheel, right? Yeah, but most of us are like, you know, we don't really doubt that way. We don't sincerely doubt the way Descartes doubted. He really did doubt. He really did have that skepticism. But why? Why did he have it? And no one got, well, one person got it on the test so far. Why did he doubt? He doubted because he lived through the scientific revolution and he saw things that, you know, he thought were just obviously true, turned out to be false. He lived through this ordeal and it shook him up. He was so shook up by this, he was so disturbed by it, he was really a skeptic for at least a moment. He really was able to doubt to that extreme, right? And so Kierkegaard, I think, is trying to say faith is kind of like this. You know, I can't just like decide to be a skeptic. Oh, I'm going to doubt everything. Oh, you're really going to doubt everything. Well, if you doubt everything, try walking off that cliff. You know, for all you know, you're not going to fall. Well, no, I don't really doubt that. You know, you don't really freaking doubt. You don't really have the skepticism Descartes did because he lived through that ordeal. You can't just decide to have faith. You can't just say, oh, I believe because I want to, because my mommy told me to, because Denmark says I'm Christian. No, it's hard to have faith. It's difficult. And you have to, and it seems Kierkegaard is saying that it does involve an ordeal. It does involve you going through something and having your faith tested and somehow it being strengthened. And so faith is not easy. That's another popular misconception. You know, when horrible things happen to them in their lives, a lot of people try to give them advice. Oh, go to church, go talk to your priest, pray more, read the good book. You know, faith will make you feel better. For Kierkegaard, no, it makes things much harder. It makes them more difficult, but it makes them more profound. So, for him, there are really three ways of approaching existence, right? When I look at the world around me, I'm thinking like, well, how am I going to approach life? How am I going to see it? For him, we've really only got three alternatives. What he might call three stages on life's way. And I don't know if I like this phrase, 3 stages, because it makes it sound like we go through these stages. Some people might not ever go through all of them. You might just stay in one, or maybe float between 1 or 2. You might not progress. But for him, there's only 3, and he labels them the aesthetic, that's 1 stage. There's the ethical, and then there's the religious. Right? And obviously faith, that's in the religious is where I actually live a life of faith, right, with this passion of faith. What about the aesthetic and the ethical, right? We're going to go through these, and probably today we only have time for the first 2. We'll probably have to save the religious for next class. But I'll summarize them briefly today. I mean, the aesthetic, basically, this is the life where probably most of you, since you're, high school, college age, most of you are seeing the world through the eyes of the aesthetic, right? To you, it's all about having fun, right? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's the aesthetic, right? You just want to have a good time. You don't like things that are boring. Those suck. You want to have fun. Damn it. So, it's like, have you ever seen that movie, This Is Spinal Tap? Have you ever seen Spinal Tap? No? It's from the 80s. It's really funny. It's like a fake documentary, mockumentary type thing. And it's like really dumb heavy metal band. They're just so stupid that it's like humorous or whatever. Kind of like, it's like before Beavis and Butthead, but they were just like Beavis and Butthead kind of thing. At the end of the movie, the credits are rolling and they're showing like all these little clips and stuff like backstage. And they talk to one of the roadies and they ask the roadie, hey, so what's your philosophy of life? And the roadie says, I want to have a good time all the time. And that's it. That's the aesthetic, right? I just want to have fun. I just want to have a good time. I want a life of pleasure. The goal, as Kierkegaard puts it, is to enjoy life in its immediacy, right? You're just sort of taking things in at the moment. You're not reflecting. You're not thinking about the future. You're not thinking about the past. You're just enjoying the moment. You're basking in the pleasure of the moment without reflection. But that's the problem. If you're looking for it, you're thinking about it. So it's sort of self-defeating, right? You want to just be in the moment. Like, I really want to have fun. What you're thinking too much about it. If you were a true aesthetic, you just sit there and have pleasure, and that'd be it, right? But no one can really do this, right? So it's really hard to sort of toe the line. We've got to find a balance, right? We want to be like Don Juan. At least that's sort of the goal, says Kierkegaard. He's like the hero of the aesthetic, Don Juan. Or, Don Giovanni, the Italian version, right? No one knows, the story of Don Juan? Spanish folklore. Don Juan, Don Giovanni. Mozart did an opera called Don Giovanni based on Don Juan. And Kierkegaard loved it. Kierkegaard loved that opera. You familiar with the opera, Don Giovanni? It's about a guy who is just the ultimate seducer, right? And he just goes from woman to woman, seducing all these different women and breaking their hearts, and he doesn't really get attached to anybody, ever, right? He just loves the conquest. He loves to conquer them, right? Until he meets Elvira, and then, she kind of, gets to him or whatever, right? But, before that, he seduces all of Spain, right? Every woman just can't resist his charm. He's like the ultimate seducer, right? And he doesn't really think about anything. He just does it. For the aesthetic, that's like the ideal. That's what they're aiming for, but they really can't ever achieve that. No one can really ever be the Don Juan. So the next best thing is to sort of make your life into a work of art. We can't really enjoy that pure sensuality of Don Juan. And so the solution is to make one's life into a work of art. We have to enjoy life like we would enjoy a piece of art, an aesthetic object. So, to demonstrate this way of approaching existence. Kierkegaard talks through the voice of A. That's the only name he gives us for this guy. A is his name. Who knows what his real name is, right? But that's the hero. And A, he's the author of The Seducer's Diary. Now, apparently A found this diary. But the more that we hear the story, the more we start to think that it's actually his diary. We're kind of like, he's kind of ashamed of this, and he's sort of just presenting it to us. But I think he's actually the seducer, right? So we have the seducer, right? We have these three characters, right? The seducer, who goes by the name Johannes, and then there's Cordelia, the poor victim of the seduction, Cordelia. And then there's Edward, okay? And Edward is sort of like this innocent bystander who gets mixed up in the game. Right? And we'll talk about this in a minute, right? The seduction and how it takes place, right? But everything is set up by the seducer. Johannes sets everything up, puts everything into place, so he can just sit back and watch all the cards fall as they will, right? And just enjoy that experience aesthetically. He compares this to rotating crops, right? We rotate crops in fields, right? Because you don't want to keep using the same crops in the same soil. It ruins the soil. So you got to rotate crops. You got to do that with your life, says the aesthetic, right? You got to keep rotating your crops. And that doesn't just mean like uprooting and going to move somewhere else or getting a new job. You have to actually change who you are as a person. Put on a different personality type, a different mask for different situations. Keep things interesting, right? Because you don't want to be bored, do you? It really sucks when you're bored. This is on page 493. This is a quote from The Seducer's Diary. We get this notion of boredom, right? How evil it really is, according to this study. 493. Let me see here. This is at the bottom of the page, the very end of the page. That long quote. People with experience maintain that proceeding from a basic principle is supposed to be very reasonable. I yield to them and I proceed from the basic principle that all people are boring. Or is there anyone who would be boring enough to contradict me in this regard? Boredom is the root of all evil. This can be traced back to the very beginning of the world. The gods were bored and therefore they created human beings. Adam was bored because he was alone, therefore Eve was created. And since that moment, boredom entered the world and grew in quantity, in exact proportion to the growth of population. Adam was bored alone. Then Adam and Eve were bored together. Then Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel were bored en famille. After that, the population of the world increased and the nations were bored en masse. To amuse themselves, they hit upon the notion of building a tower so high that it would reach the sky. This notion is just as boring as the tower was high and is a terrible demonstration of how boredom has gained the upper hand. So, for him, for Kierkegaard, he's going to say that the aesthetic person, if I'm living the life of the aesthetic, I see the world through the eyes of the aesthetic, I basically have two categories that I judge things under, right? Things are either interesting or they're boring, right? So that's the world. The world is black and white. It's either interesting and I enjoy it and I want to take part in it, or it's boring and I want to avoid it. So those are the categories of the aesthetic. So the seducer, in his seduction, that's his only aim. To make things interesting. And again, you have to rotate your crops if you're going to do this. You can't get too attached to anything. Your own personality, people around you. You can't have any really close friends jobs here and there, odd jobs, right? You have to be able to vary yourself, completely vary your personality. So what happens in the seducer's diary between Johannes and Cordelia and poor Edward, right? Well, Johannes is kind of interested in Cordelia. She's pretty hot, but she's pretty normal, an average girl, and very naive and very young. And so Johannes thinks that it'd be really fun to kind of mess with her. So what he does is he tries to frame it so that he seems like he's the matchmaker. He's concerned with Cordelia. You know, Cordelia, you're a very beautiful young lady. You're very charming, and you're getting old. You need to get married. You got to settle down, right? I want you to find a good man, right? I think Edward would be perfect for you. Edward, the man we just met today at the ball, he was such a plain fellow. But he's perfect for you, Cordelia. He's a gentleman. I talked to him, and he's very refined and this and that. So he's basically selling this guy Edward to Cordelia, but he's selling him in a way where he's safe. You know, Edward is safe. He's a good guy. I know he's not that exciting. He's really kind of boring, but he's really good for you. He's the kind of man that you should marry. He'll be stable. He'll be a good father. He'll take care of you. He'll be a provider. He's going to be boring. I mean, he's basically like planting the seeds that he's good, but he's boring. Good but boring, right? And this goes on for a while until like Cordelia and Edward actually get engaged to be married, right? And that they're about to get married. And the night before their wedding, Johannes rides his horse carriage to Cordelia's house, and he runs to her door, and he's just like out of breath, and you know, she answers the door. He says, "Oh, Cordelia, I have to speak with you." "Oh, Johannes, what's wrong, Johannes?" "Cordelia, I'm so troubled. But no, I can't do this to you because you're about to be married, and it's going to be the happiest day of your life, and God forbid that I ruin that for you. Please just forget that I even came over. Let me go back home and leave you alone." "No, Johannes, tell me, what is the problem? Why?" No, Cordelia, no, I can't. I'm so selfish, I can't tell you. I must keep to myself. No, Johannes, you must tell me. What is the problem? And Johannes says, "Cordelia, I love you. I've always loved you. But no, Edward is so good for you. He's the one. You should go with him. I'm just a bad person, and I'm horrible. I'll be a bad husband, and I'm not going to be good for you." And no, Johannes, no. You're right. I love you too, and I've always loved you. And you're the one, and Edward is boring, and you're for me, right? And they you know, have some hanky-panky, have a wild night, right? He gets the girl, and the next day, he's gone. He's gone. And Edward doesn't want to talk to her anymore, obviously, right? And her reputation is ruined, you know? She's not a fair lady anymore. She's been deflowered. And Johannes is like, "Cool, that was fun. Next." Pretty cruel, right? For him, though, for Johannes, for the seducer, he's actually done her a favor, right? And he loves her too. He does love her. Maybe not her as a person, but he loves her as an object of enjoyment, of aesthetic beauty. She was interesting, at least at that moment, right? That was fun. So he likes that. And again, she should thank him. If she's thinking of life in terms of the aesthetic, just interesting or boring, she should thank him. He helped her out. How the heck did he help her out?
Make her life interesting.
Her life is more interesting. She should be happy, right? She could have got married to boring old Edward, right? They could have gone and got a house in the country and had a couple kids and lived happily ever after. That's a boring story. I'm not going to buy that movie script. I'm not going to produce that Hollywood knows what's up until after it's over, right? And he's on to his next seduction, his next conquest, right? And everything is aimed at making life more interesting. Now, what about the ethical? What's the ethical? Now, I think this is a bit of a misnomer. It's misleading because when you think ethical, you think, oh, somebody living the ethical life is a good person. But that's not necessarily the case. Like, someone who's living an ethical life, you might not think is ethical. Like, you might think they're bad. The difference is I'm giving myself reasons for what I'm doing. Instead of just like, oh, it feels good, I'm enjoying it, I'm like, well, is this right? Is this the right thing to do? According to my own sort of ideas of right and wrong. So, I mean, I might be a Kantian, right? And I might follow Kant's ethics, and then I'm living an ethical life, because I'm thinking of, am I conforming to my moral obligation, this and that. But I could be a Wall Street tycoon who wants to rip people off, and I'm still living an ethical, and that's why it's a bit of a misnomer. I'm giving reasons, right? Like, well, I might be screwing people over and like doing all these like shady investments to mess with the market, and it messes people up. But I have a goal, right? And I want to aim at that goal, right? I want to be super rich and like make a lot of money. And so I've got an aim, I've got a goal, and I've got criteria that I live by in order to achieve that goal and that aim. So the aesthetic, he's just trying to be. I just want to sit here and be and just enjoy existence. Whereas the ethical, it's more of a focus on becoming. I want to become something. In the textbook, the example of marriage is emphasized. I think overemphasized. If you read the text, you almost get the idea that if you live the ethical life, it's about being married. And that's not the case. I think just marriage is like the perfect example because we make a commitment. When we get married, it's like we make a promise that we're going to be a certain way forever, right? And it's really hard to keep that promise, but that's what we're going to aim for. It's difficult. It's like, I want to be the perfect husband or the perfect wife. And we have a notion of what that is. What is it to be the perfect husband? Ooh, well, geez, that's hard to do, and I've got to try it, right? And that's the focus of the ethical, is some standard that I set for myself, and it's based on rational choice, right? So the whims of romantic love, the sort of like passionate, sort of spur of the moment romantic love, this is replaced with a more stable institution like marriage. What is required again is a rational choice, an engagement of the will. I'm taking my will and I'm guiding it instead of just like following my needs and my desires and my drives and my pleasure, right? And from the standpoint of the ethical, true romantic love is only possible in this way. That stuff that you hear about in the fairy tales and the Twilight Saga and all that, that's all just a bunch of BS, right? Real, true romance is about commitment and stability and rational choice, right? That's real love. It's not a slaying the dragon and saving the damsel in distress, right? In fact, if you're really going to be in love with somebody in this ethical sense, you've got to fight an opponent that is much more versatile and much more intimidating than any dragon or any sort of physical thing could be. What is the enemy to true love? What is so hard? What makes eternal love so difficult? When you get married to somebody and you say, I'm going to love you forever, and I'm going to love you with this intensity forever. What makes it so hard to do that?
To keep the intensity constant.
Right. I mean, it starts to fade through time. Like, time is really the killer. It's Kierkegaard. Time. When you first get married, you're just like, this is great, you're excited, it's new, it's fun, you love them, but then it's hard to sort of maintain that level. Time is the big killer. Right? You've got this image that you've got to keep persistently achieving. You can't just say, I'm going to be a good husband, and then just sit back. You've got to constantly strive to be a good husband or a good wife or whatever, right? And time is the killer here, right? So the ethical life requires a very strong sense of self. Unlike the aesthetic. Remember, the aesthetic person doesn't really have, they might have a self or whatever, but it's changing all the time. Their personality is going to change, depending on the situation, to make things more interesting. They're not going to be too attached to a it also has the distinction of choice. I'm actually making choices that are significant, whereas in the aesthetic, the guys are making choices, but they don't have that much weight, right? In the ethical, I'm like, geez, what do I do? I want to make sure I do something that is in line with my values. And I want to make sure that what I do is developing this sense of self that I can live with. And that holds a lot of weight. Whereas the aesthetic is like, well, I could either seduce this girl or that girl. And if I fail, I don't care that much, right? Because I'm not that attached to anything. It was just for fun anyways, and so I'll just move on, right? So choice is there, but it doesn't really have much weight. My ethical choices do have a lot of weight, and they do concern me quite a bit. Now, the aesthetic choice is between interesting and boring. That's how it looks to me. If I'm the aesthetic, is it interesting? Cool. Is it boring? Get away from it, right? I don't really have a stable sense of self. I'm just sort of drifting, just following my desires. Whereas the ethical choice is between good and evil, right? I want to do something that's good. I want to avoid evil. Now again, these are conceptions that I arrive at on my own, through my own rational reflection. Just because I'm living life in the ethical mode, again, doesn't mean I'm a good person. I could be a really shady businessman who wants to rip people off. For me, ripping people off and making money is good. Not being able to rip people off and losing money is evil, right? So you can see how this is going to take different forms in different people. The example of marriage is just the one they used in the book, right? Be a good husband, right? Be faithful, etc., etc. So marriage is a symbol of the ethical.
Travis?
Yes, question. Are we out of time or what?
No, just
Okay.
a question. I'm unclear on whether this is stages that he thinks people are progressing through over the course of their life, or are these three different kinds of people?
Right. So yeah, good. And that's why I think this is kind of a bad phrase to sum it up, because it could be stages. Like, in fact, he seems to think that most of us kind of start out aesthetically younger. When we're young, we're kind of like ADHD. We just sort of like want to have fun. When we get older, we get more mature. Things happen like this. He seems to think most of us kind of go between the two, right? That we will go through extremes. Now, there might be a person who lives their entire life in the aesthetic stage, right? That's pretty rare. Most of the time, he says we get burnt out, right? We'll party our asses off, and after a while, like, believe it or not, people, I know maybe some of y'all are too young to realize this, it does get boring. It gets old after a while. You're like, I'm tired of just getting messed up all the time, I'm tired of just partying all the time. Like, I want to make something of myself. I want to do something with my life, right? It's kind of like when I was first going to college, I just want to have fun. But then after a while, I'm like, man, I'm tired of just taking 2 classes a semester, working full time and like goofing off. Like, I'm gonna get real serious. Last couple of years I really buckled down, I got serious. But even then, when I got to the point, I'm gonna be a good student, I'm gonna be serious, right? After a while, I was like, geez, I don't know how many parties I passed up, and like, I need to go have fun, damn it. Like, I'm tired of being a good kid, I want to have fun, and I go back to the aesthetic. So he thinks we sort of, we're sort of oscillating between these two extreme poles throughout our life. Most of us, he thinks, will never make it to the religious, right? That this is a big leap, and most of us don't really have what it takes to make that leap. And it's very difficult, right? How are we doing on time here? You guys seem kind of antsy. Are we almost out? We got 6 minutes, guys, so let me try to at least get started on the religious, okay? So again, things are seen in terms of good or evil through the eyes of the ethical, interesting and boring through the eyes of the aesthetic. Now, the religious involves a sort of paradox, right? This is the part where, the system can't really deal with it, right? Hegel's system, Kant's system can't really deal with existence on this level, because once we get beyond the ethical, right? In fact, just the fact that we're thinking of different stages, just the fact that we're thinking of different ways of existing, we're already kind of beyond the ethical to begin with. We're like thinking, well, geez, maybe there's no reason for anything, right? Maybe all existence is meaningless, right? The fact that I can even think of that possibility means that I'm sort of beyond the ethical, and I'm already sort of at the threshold of the religious. And the religious is a form of existence that the individual lives in such a way that their existence cannot really be encapsulated in some ethical system. It can't be really explained. I think next class I'll start with the story of Abraham, right? Because I think for him that's very instructive, right? From the Bible, the story of Abraham and Isaac. You know, for him, Abraham has faith, right? Abraham is known as the father of faith. He had such faith in God that, well, what happened with Abraham and Isaac? Who knows the story with Isaac? And, or if you're Muslim, I guess it's debatable. Some think it was Ishmael, not Isaac, but his first son. What did God tell Abraham with his first son to do with his first son? He said, you must sacrifice Isaac. You must kill Isaac, right? And this was after God promised him all this stuff. He said, you'll be the father of many nations, this and that. And then, like, he gives him a son and says, like, oh yeah, you know that son I told you to be the father of many nations? I want you to sacrifice him to me, right? So Abraham's walking up the mountain to do it, right? He's going to sacrifice Isaac. Now, of course, at the last minute, God comes down and says, I was just testing you. And he takes the, gives him a ram instead, sacrifice this. But while he's walking up the hill, while he's preparing to do it, he doesn't know it's a test. In fact, what does he know? I mean, does he know anything that's going to happen? Is he sure of anything? No. In fact, that's why when he's walking up the hill, he does it with fear and trembling. Faith is not making his life easier. It's making it more difficult. You know, so for Kierkegaard, when he's walking up this hill, we don't know what he's thinking, right? He couldn't be thinking, oh, it's just a test. It's no big deal. God's just messing with me. He's just seeing if I pass the test. If that's what he's thinking, then he doesn't really have faith. That's not faith, right? He doesn't know what's going on, right? He's like, oh my God, what is going to happen? I don't know. Am I going to lose Isaac? I guess I am, but I'm going to be able to keep him too? God wouldn't lie to me. God says I'm going to have him, but I'm going to lose him? Look, I don't know. I really don't know what's going to happen. I'm freaking scared, but I still have faith and I'm going to go through with it because God will give me what he says. I believe I have faith. Despite the fact that it's impossible to kill Isaac and keep him, I'm going to believe it. Because what's possible with God? Anything. And I have to really believe that. And to believe that, it takes a lot. And when he's walking up the hill, here's the deal too. When I get to this part of the religious, it's when I really finally understand what matters to me and what doesn't matter. Because there's this moment of crystallization as I'm walking. If I'm Abraham walking up that hill, who knows what the guy was thinking? But we know what he wasn't thinking. He wasn't thinking about stuff that didn't matter. Right? He